This is craziest HOA moments. The cones came out, and so did the receipts. You are going to clear that sidewalk corner, because I can still see drift. That is how it started. Lisa Johnson, Design Review Board Vice Chair for the Heights at Harbor Point HOA Board, standing at the edge of my driveway in Kansas City, Kansas, at 7 in the morning during a blizzard, pointing at a tiny wedge of snow I had pushed to the curb. She had her phone out, taking pictures like it was a crime scene. I had just finished clearing my walk before my shift, and now this. I said, "Lisa, I cleared the walk. That is just overflow from the plow." She shook her head and tapped her screen. She said, "You shoveled snow onto a common area corner. That is a violation. I am ordering an HOA vendor to move it, and you will be billed for the call-out." I stared at her. I said, "What common area?" "That is the curb." She smiled, the kind of smile that means she has been waiting for this. She said, "The corner section falls under shared maintenance per the snow emergency addendum. You can be mad, or you can be compliant." I am an HVAC technician. I work nights, I am always on call, and I had a big contract starting that afternoon. I did not have time for this, but Lisa was already walking back to her car, a white sedan with an orange reflective marker clipped to the antenna like a flag. She turned and shouted over the wind. She said, "You will pay the fee, then you will pay the fee about the fee." Then she drove off, tires crunching through the slush. I went inside, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the HOA rules portal. The snow emergency addendum was a 3-page PDF with about 20 clauses, most of them vague. Nothing in there defined corner section or explained who was responsible for curb overflow. I took screenshots anyway. Then I called my friend Eric, a CPA who lives 2 blocks over. I said Lisa just threatened to bill me for snow removal because I supposedly dumped it on a common area. Eric groaned. He said, "She did that to the Hendersons last month. They paid $800 for a 10-minute shovel job." I said, "800? He said, "Yeah. Vendor call-out, emergency surcharge, administrative fee. It is all buried in the addendum." I said, "Can she actually do that?" He said, "Only if the board ratified the addendum. Ask for the meeting minutes." I sent an email to the property management company requesting the minutes for the snow emergency addendum approval. Then I got dressed for my shift, grabbed my toolbox, and headed out. The driveway was already half covered again. Drifting snow that recovers cleared paths is the signature of every Kansas City winter storm, and this one was no exception. That afternoon, I got a text from the HOA compliance line. It said, "Violation notice issued for Unit 47B. Vendor dispatch confirmed. Payment due within 72 hours. I pulled over in a grocery store parking lot and called the management company. The woman who answered said her name was Angela. I said, "I just got a text about a vendor call-out I did not authorize." Angela said, "Let me pull your file." There was a pause. She said, "It says here the board vice chair submitted a photo and requested emergency snow removal under the addendum." I said, "What addendum?" She said, "The one from November." I said, "Can you send me the meeting minutes where that was approved?" She hesitated. She said, "I will check with the board." I did not hear back that day. I worked a double because the contract site had a furnace failure, and by the time I got home it was almost midnight. There was a certified letter taped to my door. I pulled it down and opened it under the porch light. It was dated 2 days earlier, which made no sense because I had just gotten the text that afternoon. The letter said I owed $795 for emergency snow removal services rendered, plus a $50 administrative processing fee. If I did not pay within 72 hours, the amount would be sent to collections and a lien would be filed. I took a picture of the envelope, the letter, and the postmark. The postmark was from yesterday. Someone had backdated the letter. I called Eric again. I said, "They backdated a certified letter." He said, "That is fraud." I said, "How do I prove it?" He said, "You already did. Keep the envelope." Then he said, "You need to get ahead of this." File a records request for everything: the addendum approval minutes, the vendor contract, the authorization for the call-out, and the ledger entry for your account. If they cannot produce all four, they cannot enforce the fee. I said, how long does that take? He said, they have 10 business days under the bylaws. The next morning, I submitted the records request through the portal. Then I went outside to clear the driveway again. The plow had come through overnight and left a 2-foot berm across the bottom of my driveway. I was halfway through breaking it up when Lisa pulled up in her white sedan. She got out holding a tape measure and a clipboard. She walked right up to the sidewalk edge and started measuring the cleared width. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Compliance check. You are required to maintain a minimum 48-inch clear path under the snow emergency addendum." I said I cleared 4 feet. She crouched down, stretched the tape across, and shook her head. She said 46 inches. That is a secondary violation. I will be submitting this to the board tonight. I said, "You are measuring snowdrift. That path was 4 feet when I finished." She stood up and smiled. She said, "Measurements are taken at time of inspection. You can be mad or you can be compliant." Then she walked back to her car, got in, and drove off. I stood there in the cold, holding my shovel, staring at the orange reflective marker she had planted at my curb like it was some kind of warning beacon. That night I got an email from Angela at the management company. It said the records request had been forwarded to the board for review, and I should expect a response within the statutory time frame. I replied and asked for the name of the HOA attorney. She did not answer. I called Eric and told him about the tape measure stunt. He said, "She is building a paper trail to justify the fees. You need to do the same. Document everything: photos, timestamps, weather reports, plow schedules. If she is going to nickel and dime you, make her prove every single claim." If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories where the revenge is ice cold and satisfying. I started keeping a log. Every time I cleared the driveway, I took photos with timestamps. Every time the plow came through, I noted the time and took a picture of the berm. Every time Lisa showed up, I recorded video on my phone. By the end of the week, I had over 40 entries. Then the next notice arrived. This one was not certified. It was just taped to my door again. Same cheap printer paper, same unsigned block text. It said I owed an additional $250 for non-compliance with sidewalk width standards, payable immediately. The notice referenced a board resolution from December, but it did not include a resolution number or a date. I forwarded the notice to Eric. He called me an hour later. He said, "I checked the public meeting minutes on the county site. There was no board meeting in December. The last meeting was November 15th, and the only item on the agenda was holiday decorations." I said, "So this resolution does not exist?" He said, "Not unless they passed it in a closed session, which would be illegal." I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Keep pushing on the records request. If they cannot produce the resolution, they cannot enforce the fee. And if they try, you file a complaint with the state HOA ombudsman." 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a man said his name was Kyle, and he was with the towing company contracted by the Heights at Harbor Point HOA board. He said he had received a dispatch order to tow a vehicle from Unit 47B for unpaid fines and non-compliance. I said, "What vehicle?" He said, "The work van registered to your address." I said, "That van is not blocking anything, and I do not have any unpaid fines." He said, "I am just following the dispatch order, man. If you have an issue, you need to call the HOA." Then he hung up. I ran outside. My van was still in the driveway, covered in snow but untouched. I called Eric. I said, "They just tried to tow my van." He said, "Did they actually hook it?" I said, "No, but the driver said he had a dispatch order." Eric said, "That is harassment. You need to file a police report and get a restraining order against the tow company." I said, "Can I do that?" He said, "Absolutely. If they show up without proper authorization, that is attempted theft." I called the non-emergency line and explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would come by to take a report. While I waited, I went back inside and pulled up the HOA bylaws. There was a section on vehicle towing, and it was very specific. Towing required written notice to the owner at least 72 hours in advance, posted notice on the vehicle at least 48 hours in advance, and photographic proof of the violation. None of that had happened. I took screenshots of the bylaw section and saved them in a folder labeled Evidence. The officer showed up about an hour later. I showed him the text from the tow driver, the notices I had received, and the bylaw section on towing. He took notes and said he would file the report, but there was not much he could do unless the tow truck actually showed up and tried to take the van. He said, "If that happens, call 911 immediately. Do not try to stop them yourself." I said, "What if they show up while I am asleep?" He said, "Set up a camera if you can, that way you have proof." I thanked him and went back inside. I did not have a fancy security system, but I had an old dash cam I used in the van. I rigged it up in the front window facing the driveway, plugged it into a battery pack, and set it to record on motion. Then I went to bed, knowing that if Lisa tried anything, I would have it on video. The next morning, I woke up to 6 motion alerts on my phone. I pulled up the dashcam app and scrolled through the clips. Most of them were just the plow going by or a neighbor walking their dog. But the 5th clip made my stomach drop. It was time-stamped at 4:30 in the morning. A white sedan pulled up to my curb and Lisa got out. She walked up to my van, brushed snow off the windshield, and took a picture. Then she pulled an orange reflective marker out of her coat pocket and stuck it on the driver's side mirror. She got back in her car and drove off. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. I saved the clip to 3 different places: my phone, my laptop, and Eric's cloud drive. Then I texted Eric. I said, "I got her. She was at my van at 4:30 this morning planting evidence." He called me immediately. He said, "That is gold. Do not delete that. Do not post it. Just hold on to it until you need it." I said, "When will I need it?" He said, "When she tries to escalate." And she will. He was right. That afternoon, I got another email from Angela. It said the board had reviewed my records request and determined that some documents were protected by attorney-client privilege and could not be released. However, they were providing a summary of the snow emergency addendum approval, which stated that the addendum had been ratified by unanimous consent at a special meeting on November 20th. I opened the attachment. It was a 1-page memo with no signatures, no meeting minutes, and no vote tally. Just a paragraph saying the board had approved the addendum, and it was now in effect. I forwarded the memo to Eric. He called back in under 5 minutes. He said, "This is garbage. There is no proof of a meeting, no attendee list, no vote count, no notarized signature. This would not hold up in small claims, let alone a real courtroom." I said, "So what do I do?" He said, "You call their bluff. Send a reply saying you need the full meeting minutes, the attendee list, and the original signed resolution. If they cannot produce it, the addendum is not enforceable." I drafted the email and hit send. Then I went outside to clear the driveway again. It had snowed another 4 inches overnight, and the plow had left another berm. I was halfway through when Lisa pulled up again. This time she was not alone. There was a man with her, maybe mid-50s, wearing a reflective vest and carrying a shovel. Lisa got out and pointed at the corner section. She said, "This is the area. He needs to clear it to the property line and remove all snow from the common walkway." The man nodded and started shoveling. I said, "Who is this?" Lisa said, "HOA vendor. You were notified." I said I was not notified of anything. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text. It was time-stamped from 2 hours earlier and addressed to a number I did not recognize. I said, "That is not my number." She shrugged. She said, "It is the number on file. You can update it at the next board meeting." The vendor worked for about 10 minutes and then left. Lisa handed me a slip of paper. It was an invoice for $350, $200 for labor, $100 for emergency dispatch, $50 for administrative processing. I said, "I am not paying this." She said, then it goes to collections, and we file a lien. You can be mad, or you can be compliant. She got back in her car and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway holding an invoice for work I never authorized. I called Eric again. I said, she just had a vendor clear snow I already cleared and handed me a $350 invoice. He said, do not pay it. This is extortion. She is manufacturing violations to rack up fees. I said, how do I stop her? He said, you go to the next board meeting and you make her explain every single charge in front of everyone, and you bring that dash cam footage. I said, when is the next meeting? He said, check the HOA calendar. It should be posted on the portal. I pulled up the portal. The next board meeting was in 6 days. The agenda was not posted yet, but the meeting notice said residents could submit items for public comment by emailing the board secretary. I drafted an email requesting time to address snow emergency enforcement procedures and outstanding fees. I attached a copy of the backdated certified letter, the unsigned resolution memo, and a screenshot of the bogus text message Lisa had shown me. Then I hit send and waited. 2 days later, I got a reply from the board secretary. It said my request for public comment had been received and I would be allotted 3 minutes at the end of the meeting. 3 minutes. I called Eric and told him. He said, that is not enough time to lay out everything. You need to focus on one thing, the proof that the addendum was never ratified. If you can get them to admit that on the record, everything else falls apart. I said, what if they just deny it? He said, then you escalate. File a complaint with the state, get a lawyer, or go to small claims. But you need that meeting first. The night before the meeting, I could not sleep. I kept running through what I was going to say, how I was going to say it, what documents I was going to show. I had printed copies of everything, the backdated letter, the unsigned memo, the bylaw section on towing, the dashcam screenshots, and the invoice from the vendor. I put it all in a folder and set it by the door. Then I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The meeting was at 7 in the evening in the clubhouse. I got there early and sat in the back row. The room was small, maybe 15 chairs, half of them empty. Lisa was at the front table with 3 other board members. She was wearing the same pink parka, and she had a stack of papers in front of her. When the meeting started, the board president ran through the standard agenda items, financials, landscaping updates, holiday decoration rules. Then he said, we have one item for public comment. Unit 47B has requested time to address snow emergency enforcement. You have 3 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front. I opened my folder and pulled out the backdated letter. I said, this letter is dated 2 days before I received the text about the vendor call-out. The postmark proves it was mailed the day after the text. That is fraud. Lisa did not even look up. She said, administrative error. It has been corrected in the system. I said, then why did I get an invoice for work I never authorized? She said, the work was performed under the snow emergency addendum, which you violated. I said, show me the meeting minutes where that addendum was approved. She opened her folder and pulled out the same one-page memo I had already seen. She said, this is the summary. I said, that is not meeting minutes. Where is the attendee list? Where is the vote tally? Where is the signed resolution? The board president cleared his throat. He said, the minutes are confidential pending legal review. I said, you cannot enforce a rule that was never ratified. If this addendum was approved, you are required to publish the meeting minutes under the bylaws. He looked at Lisa. She said, the minutes will be available once the attorney has reviewed them. I said, when will that be? She said, when the attorney is finished. I said, that is not an answer. The room went quiet. One of the other board members, an older man I did not recognize, leaned forward. He said, can we just provide the minutes? Lisa shot him a look. She said, not until legal review is complete. The board president said, moving on, next agenda item. I said, I still have a minute left. He said, your time is up. Please sit down. I walked back to my seat, folder in hand, heart pounding. Eric was right. They were stonewalling. After the meeting, I walked out to the parking lot. Eric was waiting by my van. He said, "How did it go?" I said, "They refused to show the minutes." He said, "Then we file a complaint with the state ombudsman and we request a formal audit of the HOA financials. If they are hiding the minutes, they are probably hiding other things too." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "A few weeks, maybe longer. But it puts them on notice. And once the state starts asking questions, the HOA attorney is going to tell them to settle." I filed the complaint the next morning. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from the HOA attorney. It said the board had reviewed my complaint and determined that all enforcement actions were conducted in accordance with the governing documents. However, as a gesture of goodwill, the board was willing to waive 50% of the outstanding fees if I agreed to withdraw the state complaint and sign a release. I showed the letter to Eric. He said, "Do not sign anything. This is an admission that they know they are wrong. If they are offering to cut the fees in half, it means they cannot defend the full amount." I said, "So what do I do?" He said, "You hold out. Let the state do its job." 3 weeks later, I got a call from a woman who said she was with the state HOA division. She said they had received my complaint and they were opening an investigation. She asked if I had copies of the notices, invoices, and meeting materials. I said yes and offered to send them. She said that would be helpful and she would be in touch. I hung up and immediately forwarded everything to her email. Then I called Eric. I said, "The state is investigating." He said, "Good. Now we wait." While I waited, the snow kept falling. Kansas City got hit with 3 more storms in 2 weeks, and every time I cleared my driveway, Lisa showed up with her tape measure or her phone or some new excuse to issue a notice. I stopped engaging. I just took pictures, logged the date and time, and went back inside. The orange reflective marker stayed planted at my curb like a monument to bureaucratic pettiness. One morning, I woke up to find it half buried in fresh snow, and I left it there. Let her dig it out if she cared that much. Then I got another call from the tow company. This time it was a different driver. He said, "I am outside Unit 47B with a dispatch order to tow a work van for unpaid HOA fees." I said, "Did the HOA provide you with written authorization?" He paused. He said, "I have a work order from the property management company." I said, "That is not authorization. Under the HOA bylaws, you need written notice to the owner at least 72 hours in advance, posted notice on the vehicle at least 48 hours in advance, and photographic proof of the violation. Do you have all of that?" He said, "Hold on." I heard him talking to someone in the background. Then he came back on and said, "I am going to call the management company." I said, "Good idea. And while you are at it, ask them to send you the meeting minutes where the snow emergency addendum was approved, because they do not exist." The driver hung up and drove off without hooking my van. I went inside and called Eric. I said, "They tried again." He said, "Did you get it on camera?" I said, "No, but I have the call recorded." He said, "Even better. That is proof they are trying to bypass the bylaws. Save that recording. You might need it." I said, "For what?" He said, "For when you sue them." I let her think I was cornered because my trump card needed her to overreach. And overreach she did. A week later, I got a call from Angela at the management company. She said the board had scheduled a special closed hearing to discuss my account and I was required to attend. I said, "Required?" She said, "If you do not attend, the board will proceed with enforcement actions, including filing a lien." I said, "When is the hearing?" She said, "Tomorrow at 6. I said, "That is not enough notice." She said, "It is under the emergency enforcement clause." I said, "What clause?" She hung up. I called Eric. I said, "They scheduled a closed hearing with less than 24 hours notice." He said, "That is illegal. Closed hearings require 7 days written notice under the bylaws." I said, "What do I do?" He said, "You show up and you record everything." and you bring that dashcam footage. This is the moment. I said, what moment? He said, the moment you flip the table. The hearing was in the same clubhouse room. When I walked in, Lisa was sitting at the front table with the board president and the HOA attorney, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a bored expression. Lisa had a thick folder in front of her. The board president said, "This is a closed hearing to review enforcement actions for Unit 47B. You have been provided notice under the Emergency Enforcement Clause." I said, "What emergency?" He said, "Unpaid fees and repeated violations." I said, "I have not violated anything." Lisa opened her folder and started reading off a list: failure to maintain sidewalk width, snow deposition on common areas, obstruction of HOA vendor access, failure to respond to notices. She went on for 2 minutes. When she finished, the board president said, "Do you have anything to say?" I pulled out my phone. I said, "I have a recording of a tow company driver admitting that the HOA dispatched him without proper authorization. I also have dashcam footage of Lisa planting an orange marker on my van at 4:30 in the morning to manufacture a violation. And I have a copy of the bylaws showing that this hearing violates the 7-day notice requirement." The attorney sat up. He said, "May I see that footage?" I handed him my phone. He watched the clip twice. Then he looked at Lisa. He said, "Did you place this marker on the vehicle?" She said, "I was conducting a compliance check." He said, "At 4:30 in the morning?" She did not answer. He handed my phone back and turned to the board president. He said, "I need to speak with the board in private." The board president said, "We are in the middle of a hearing." The attorney said, "Now." They stood up and walked into the hallway. I could hear raised voices through the door. When they came back, the attorney said, "This hearing is concluded. All enforcement actions are suspended pending a full review." I said, "What about the fees?" He said, "The board will issue a revised statement." I said, "When?" He said, "Within 10 business days." Then he looked at Lisa. He said, "And I need to speak with you about proper procedures." I walked out of the clubhouse and sat in my van for a minute, hands shaking. Then I called Eric. I said, "I just showed them the dashcam footage." He said, "And?" I said, "The attorney suspended all enforcement actions and told Lisa he needed to talk to her about procedures." Eric laughed. He said, "You just flipped the table." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "They are going to try to settle quietly. Do not let them. Push for a full refund, a public apology, and a policy change. Make them own it." I submitted the packet to the HOA attorney and watched the tone change instantly. Within a week, I got a call from Angela. She said the board had reviewed my account and determined that several enforcement actions had been issued in error. All outstanding fees would be waived, and the board would be issuing a formal notice to all residents clarifying the snow emergency procedures. I said, "What about the lien threat?" She said there was never a lien filed. I said, "But Lisa said there would be." She said, "The board did not authorize a lien." I said, "So Lisa was acting without authority?" She paused. She said, "The board is addressing that internally." I said, "I want that in writing." She said, "I will send you a letter." The letter arrived 3 days later. It confirmed that all fees had been waived, no lien had been filed, and the board was revising the snow emergency addendum to clarify enforcement procedures. It also included a 1-sentence apology for any inconvenience. I took a picture of the letter and posted it in the neighborhood group chat. Within an hour, 6 other residents replied saying they had also been hit with bogus snow fees. One of them said she had paid $400 because she did not know she could fight it. Another said Lisa had threatened to tow his car for parking too close to a snowbank. The chat blew up. People started sharing screenshots of notices, invoices, and threatening texts from Lisa. By that evening, there were over 50 messages. The next board meeting was packed. Every seat was full, and people were standing in the back. The board president opened with a statement saying the board was committed to fair and transparent enforcement, and they had retained an independent auditor to review all snow-related fees issued in the past 6 months. Then he said, effective immediately, Lisa Johnson is stepping down as Design Review Board Vice Chair and will no longer be involved in enforcement actions. Lisa was sitting in the front row. She did not say anything. She just stood up and walked out. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the whole room joined in. The board president tried to restore order, but it was too late. People were shouting questions, demanding refunds, asking how this had gone on so long without oversight. The meeting ran over by an hour, and by the end, the board had agreed to refund all snow-related fees issued under the disputed addendum and to hold a vote on whether to rescind the addendum entirely. 2 weeks later, the city of Kansas City sent a formal warning to the Heights at Harbor Point HOA board. It said the HOA had been interfering with municipal snow removal routes by issuing enforcement actions against residents who complied with city sidewalk clearing requirements. The warning stated that if the HOA continued to issue conflicting instructions, the city would file a complaint with the county and potentially seek an injunction. The board held an emergency meeting and voted to rescind the snow emergency addendum entirely. They also voted to remove Lisa as meeting chair and revoke her access to the HOA compliance system. The HOA removes the enforcement action and voids the ledger entry. Karen is removed as meeting chair and loses the microphone control. A records request that exposes contradictions and edits was the thread that unraveled everything. The state ombudsman completed her investigation and found that the snow emergency addendum had never been properly ratified. The memo Lisa had presented was a draft that had never been voted on, and the special meeting she claimed had approved it had never actually occurred. The ombudsman issued a formal finding that the HOA had violated multiple provisions of the state HOA statute, and she recommended that the board undergo mandatory governance training. The board complied. Lisa did not return to any meetings after that. The funny karma moment came a month later. The HOA hired a new property management company, and the new manager sent an email to all residents saying they were conducting a full audit of all enforcement actions issued in the previous year. As part of the audit, they requested copies of all photos, videos, and documentation related to any disputed fees. I sent them my entire folder, the dashcam footage, the backdated letter, the bogus text message, the invoice, the bylaw screenshots, and the call recording. 2 weeks later, the manager sent another email. It said the audit had identified significant procedural violations, and the previous property management company had been terminated for failing to follow proper protocols. It also said that Karen tries to flex authority, and the policy says she cannot. The new manager attached a revised version of the snow rules that was 2 pages long, written in plain English, and actually made sense. I ran into Eric at the grocery store a few days later. He said, "You hear about Lisa?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "She tried to run for the board again at the annual election. She got 12 votes out of 300. I said, "Good." He said, "Better than good." The new board president is the guy who asked for the meeting minutes at that first hearing. He is already talking about drafting a residents' Bill of Rights. I said, "About time." The orange reflective marker stayed at my curb until spring. When the snow finally melted, I picked it up and threw it in the trash. I cleared my sidewalk every time it snowed that winter, and no one said a word. The driveway stayed clear. The van stayed in the driveway. And Lisa stayed away. I hope your night is calm.